Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Reactive to Proactive, How to Improve Efficiency and Oversight of Your P2P Process, brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by ACL. We have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. If you have any technical questions or issues using the webinar platform, please use the chat box and I will respond right away. If you have any issues with the sound, please click on the phone icon located above the chat window to receive the teleconference information. For those that do need to call in, to ensure call quality, everyone's lines have been muted today. If you happen to get disconnected, you can log on again using the instructions provided in your webinar confirmation email. If you continue to experience difficulty, please email webinars@iofm.com and we will respond right away. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please type your questions into the chat box and hit send to submit them. And at the end of our webinar, we will have our presenters answer questions. If we're not able to get to all questions, we will respond post-webinar via email. We will also have 4 polling questions during this webinar. A pop-up box will appear when we run each poll. Please choose from the multiple choice answers and hit submit. We would love your participation and insight today. Our speakers for today are Mark Brousseau and Noni Dalton. Mark Brousseau is a noted analyst, speaker, writer, and marketer with more than 21 years of experience in advising leading providers of financial operations, solutions, and services. Brousseau is president of Brousseau & Associates, a full-service strategic marketing and business development consultancy with the largest client base of any firm of its kind. Brousseau & Associates counts among its clients many top solutions and services providers in the payables, receivables, payments, document management, and healthcare verticals. Noni Dalton is the Principal Product Manager at ACL. She is a veteran product manager with a passion for innovative technologies that meet customers' needs. At ACL, she's focused on championing solutions specific to finance customers, as well as contributing to the development of new features, market intelligence, and product strategy. Noni has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Business Administration, specializing in the management of technology. And at this time, I would like to welcome our speakers.
Hey, thank you so much, Laura. And thank you all for joining us today. So does it ever feel like you're a firefighter? All you do is spend your days putting out fires. We have that emergency payment here. We have that exception over here. We've got this purchaser who needs to get this supplier in the system over here. A lot of these problems are related to the fact that we're always behind the 8 ball. We don't have visibility into our processes. We don't have a line of sight to stay ahead of our processes. And that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to show you how manual and semi-automated P2P processes are impacting your visibility and putting you in a reactive position rather than a proactive position. We're going to show how it is that automation can help you proactively identify errors and fraud so you can avoid financial loss as well as improve your financial decision-making. And we're also going to provide you with some how-to strategies on how it is you can put the ideas we give you today to work in your own organization. But before we do all that, we're going to start with a poll question, which is about to be displayed on your screen. We want to know, what is the biggest risk in your P2P process? Is it overly complex workflows? Is it easily circumvented controls and workarounds? Is it lack of real-time oversight and data transparency? Or is it increasing complexity? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen. We're going to discuss the results in just a moment. So everywhere I go, Noni, in the fall, all the conferences I attended, what I heard from senior finance execs is, man, we want more out of our P2P function. We don't want them to be a back office function. We want them to be a strategic partner to the organization. Is this what you're hearing? And if so, what's going on here?
Yeah, we hear a lot of that as well with the different customers and clients that I'm able to work with. A lot of their P2P processes, they see people struggling. They have people on their teams that are going through and manually going through the processes day in, day out, but they don't have a lot of information actually coming back up to the leaders that they're able to use to improve how their budgets are operating, if they can get insight into any fraud that's happening, be able to plan more effectively. And so they're really looking for tools to help them with that.
And the reality is that this is more than just an operational function. This is becoming a risk burden to organizations. I mean, we face some real risks if we can't get a hold of our data or get control of our data. Are you hearing that senior finance execs are as concerned about that as you and I are?
It is a little bit mixed, but generally there's a growing trend in terms of the senior finance leaders really shifting a lot of their focus into more of risk management activities. So it's not, I would say it extends beyond P2P. It actually extends to all areas that the finance function can look at, including overall performance and making sure that they can achieve their strategic objectives.
We asked our attendees what is the biggest risk in their P2P processes. 1/3 of the attendees on the line said increasing complexity. 28% said lack of real-time oversight and data controls. 26% said fact is that the majority of IOFM members say that their P2P processes are more complex today than they were just 2 years ago. I hear all the time from P2P practitioners who say their knees are buckling over the complexity of what they're asked to do. What's going on? Why is it that P2P processes are more complex for organizations today?
Yeah, some of the reasons that we see is that you've got multiple. Some of the reasons come from just in terms of how processes have been set up, but you've also got overarching compliance complexity that's being added to the process as well. So when you look at the volume of transactions that you're dealing with, the number of compliance regulations, there's a lot of areas that start to increase the complexity overall in those processes.
The key takeaway I think we want folks to go with today is that if you're operating in that manual or semi-automated environment, chances are you're not going to be able to manage that increasing complexity as well as that double whammy of the increased demands for real-time visibility into your P2P data. And we know that when it comes to P2P, while cash is king, data is the trump card. Today it's all about the data. 81% of organizations tell us that their data is critical or important to their finance operations. 2 years from now, organizations anticipate that that's going to increase. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the reality is that the information we're using in our back office goes far beyond our four walls. Organizations are using P2P data for some very big, important functions. All starts, of course, with forecasting, budgeting, and planning. This data is critical for forecasting, and this has a lot to do with the fact that corporate America does such an abysmal job of forecasting beyond its current quarter. We simply don't have line of sight into what's happening with our invoices and purchasing. What's more, organizations are using P2P data for finance and procurement, for developing payment strategies. This is a real watchword in 2019, optimizing your payments to suppliers. Well, good luck doing that if you don't know what's happening with your cash or your spending. What's more, P2P data is vital to enhancing supplier management as well as handling your cash appropriately. And one of the things we hear more and more is that businesses are placing a higher premium on spend management. In fact, according to IOFM data from just earlier this year, the majority of organizations believe the spend management is going to become more important 2 years from now than it is this year. But wait, 1/3 of you tell us that it's already very important to your organization. So it's clear that if you don't have a vision of how it is you're going to get visibility across your P2P lifecycle, not just automating invoices, folks, but across that P2P lifecycle, you're going to be behind your peers. The challenge is, we know that 3/4 of you are operating in a manual or semi-automated P2P environment, one in which paper and manual processes really rule the day. And across that P2P lifecycle, whether it's procurement, order management, AP, payments, you name it, that's going to have big implications. You simply can't manage your information appropriately. Controllers tell us that visibility is their biggest gripe about accounts payable in P2P. 45% of controllers say the lack of visibility to invoices and payables information is a major challenge. 42% of them cite difficulty handling, managing, and finding invoices. They simply can't lay their hands on the information they need when they need it. This makes perfect sense. Think of what you people do with your invoices after you process them. You shove them into somebody's file drawer. You put them in a cardboard box and you ship them to a warehouse off-site. Many cases, invoices are misfiled, they're lost, they're destroyed prematurely. Good luck trying to get at the information you need to forecast your spending, to understand where we are with controls, with our supplier relationships, with our contract compliance. What's more, we also know that the problems are just as pervasive when it comes to procurement. In many cases, we're using paper-based processes to initiate purchases from suppliers. We're never managing the data associated with supplier records. We have filthy vendor master databases. And so it's no surprise that 38% of controllers tell us the cost to process invoices is too high. And another 17% say they have difficulty capturing vendor discounts. They don't have visibility into what's happening with their invoices. They don't see where the opportunities lie for capturing those lucrative discounts. 66% of CFOs, well, for their part, they say a lack of basic visibility into key insight areas is a challenge. And this is key. The role of the CFO is changing. They're no longer being asked to be a financial scorekeeper for the organization. Today, the president, the board, expect them to be a partner to the organization, to help make strategic decisions based on financial information. Financial information that I just told you they can't lay their hands on. So how are they supposed to do this job? Well, they expect you as a P2P practitioner to help them get the information they need. But good luck doing that when you're operating in that manual or semi-automated environment. We know that based on those antiquated ways that we process POs and invoices, key information is not captured. In many cases, it's poorly organized. We have incompatible ways of capturing and managing data depending on how an invoice arrives, depending on who the approver is, depending on where the invoice enters our organization. What's more, we know that information is not timely. We can't get at the information we need when we need it. In most cases, our systems are badly integrated. Think for a moment of all the money your organization spends on its ERP system, the financial nerve center of your organization. And yet, despite those massive investments in your ERP, I bet you the processes that lie in front of it are manual or semi-automated. This makes no sense. We're keying information into an ERP. We get no benefit of having 360-degree visibility into our suppliers and into our transactions. We have no way to help us resolve exceptions. We have no tools to help us identify potential compliance issues or potential fraud. And in all this environment, our decision makers cannot access key data. And this goes back to the slide before. This is why we do such a bad job at forecasting, budgeting, managing our suppliers, ensuring our contracts are in compliance. The list goes on and on. The root of all evil, folks, yeah, it's your bad data policies. But you've had enough. Organizations have told us they're going to do something about this. And so when we look at the top P2P priorities for next year, standing out among the rest are the need to better link P2P processes and systems, the types of initiatives that Noni's going to talk about in a few minutes. What's more, 35% of you say you want to improve reporting and analytics, something that's a pipe dream in a paper-based environment. And 32% of you want to improve collaboration and communication with procurement. Moreover, many of you want to improve collaboration with other stakeholders across the organization, as well as those outside of the organization. And you also recognize that it's high time that we get a handle on our compliance burden. There's about 140,000 regulatory rules on the books today on how it is we manage things in this country. And as I speak to you right now, someone's dreaming up regulation number 140,001. And it's time that we figured out a way to get control of our processes so we can ensure that we don't put our organization at risk of compliance violations or, for that matter, fraud. And our P2P practitioners understand all of this. They know that in order to make their function the strategic powerhouse that they envision it to be over the next several years, they're going to have to do something about their visibility into their data. You know that that data is gold. You know that it's something the organization wants from you. And we're seeing this. Organizations have had demand over the past 2 years for real-time visibility into data, and over the next 2 years, they anticipate we're going to see even greater demand for real-time visibility. The rub is that 40% of all IOFM members are still managing this P2P data using Excel spreadsheets. Excel spreadsheets that are outdated the moment you hit save and you send them on. There's got to be a better way, you reason. Well, there is. It's just not the way you're doing things today. And it's high time that we did this because the enterprise wants this data. Next year, one of the things you're going to hear from your stakeholders across the organization is that they're going to want more reporting from you. And it might be different reports from different stakeholders than you're used to hearing from. The story here is that the enterprise wants access to your P2P data. They can put it to good use to help ensure the safety of the financial supply chain, to help drive budget compliance, to root out that maverick spend. They want to use it for cash forecasting and cash reporting, not only internally but up to the board. They also want to use it for better managing working capital in this high-growth economy that we seem to think is coming. It's going to be imperative that we have control of our cash so we can make the appropriate investments to grow markets, to drive innovation, to stand out from competitors. What's more, this data is going to help us to better manage our supplier relationships. We recognize that in times of economic growth, our suppliers are key to us. And suppliers want to do business with organizations that make it easy to do business with them. And if you have better control of your data, you can ensure contract compliance, you know which suppliers you're having the most spend with so you can focus on those relationships. Well, that's the type of thing that's going to help you improve that supplier relationship. Organizations are also going to try to drive compliance and fraud mitigation in 2019. If you look at the priorities of CFOs, fraud and compliance mitigation continue to race up the CFO's agenda, right behind cash flow analysis, liquidity management, and preserving costs. Why is this? CFOs know intuitively that issues with compliance and fraud cost their companies big bucks. It also puts their reputation at stake, not theirs, their company's reputation. And so we're going to see an environment where organizations are asking P2P to serve up more information and to not just throw it over the fence, but to do it in a way that adds context. They want P2P to be more collaborative, to make sense of the information they're serving up. So now we're talking about an environment where data is going to be real time, it's going to be personalized, it's going to be complete, it's going to be contextual, it's going to be on demand. And when you do this, when you serve up the data the way the enterprise wants you to, Now we're on to something. Now we're able to measure our key performance indicators in ways we never dreamed of. We're able to better manage our day-to-day processes across the P2P lifecycle, not just invoice processing. We're able to improve our operations, and not just in the walls of P2P, but beyond. Remember, our data touches all these other key stakeholders, and that's going to help them do their jobs. And when we improve P2P visibility, now we're also able to better drive cash management, spend analysis. And yes, we're going to be able to identify volatility. In case those potholes in the economy should resurface, we'll be able to dodge them. It's also going to allow us to give management the data they want. This is an interesting chart. For years, IOFM has been asking managers of finance which metrics are most important to them. And what we've seen is that they're not just interested in those finance metrics that you'd anticipate anymore. No, now they're also interested in those operational metrics, things like cost savings and cost avoidance, because CFOs recognize that getting visibility into their cash, that's the table stakes. What they also want to be able to do is get visibility into their operations so that they're able to ensure that their organization is agile enough to support the company as it grows. Are you scalable? Are you agile? Are you accurate? These are the things that finance execs want. And this chart really brings it home. When you look at top performing finance operations, they're spending more time on data analysis versus data gathering, and a lot less time on time to close and reporting results. These are the organizations that have automated their information delivery. And what's more, they're able to measure their key metrics. They know their key performance indicators, those things that introduce risk into their process. They can anticipate them. Things like errors. These are some statistics from IOFM that show the share of duplicate payments. And for those of you who are in a manual operation and still are trying to fool yourself into thinking that you're able to be as accurate as organizations that are highly automated, this should be a cold shower. Folks, if you're operating in a manual or semi-automated environment, you simply don't have the level of accuracy of your highly automated peers. What's more, this means you have more risk than your peers. And we started this whole conversation off talking about complexity, and you all identified that complexity is a potential risk into your operations. And for those of you who think that this is the biggest challenge today, I have really bad news for you. Over the next 2 years, a majority of IOFM members believe that the risks are going to become higher, or organizations are going to face more complexity. So when you're struggling with how it is that you're supposed to cost justify P2P automation in 2019, here's the chart. We're already struggling to keep our head above water. How are we possibly going to do this 2 years from now? And that brings us to our next poll question, which is about to be displayed on your screen. We want to know, what is the most pressing challenge you are currently facing when it comes to your P2P data? Is it that you're unable to access timely information for decision making? Is it that your data quality and governance are inadequate to support decision making? Is it that you have unintegrated financial systems? Is it the customization of ERP which leads to control breakdowns? Or is it lack of ERP knowledge which translates into incorrect data? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen, and we're going to discuss the results in just a moment. All right, Noni, so I'm contending that now is the time, that if you let this go one more moment, your organization is going to find itself in a hole that it might not be able to climb out of. Do you agree with that?
I think you're onto something there, Mark, for sure. I think as we go into some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in a couple of moments, that those manual processes that have stood the test of time for about 100 years are really showing the cracks these days.
what's the biggest driver in 2019 of P2P automation in your estimation?
So some of the big things that I think is happening, it comes down to time and available resources. And when you start to look at people, the thing that's really driving automation and robotic process automation, which is a big buzzword today, it really comes down to the fact that there are limited resources on the team, and more is being asked of the finance team to be able to perform, and CFOs are being asked for more information. So where do you find that time? And so that's really one of the things that's starting to drive. How do you find that time within your organization? And that really comes down to the driving force behind the need for automation.
We asked our attendees, what is the most pressing challenge they currently face when it comes to their data management? 26% of the folks on the line identified unintegrated financial systems. 24% of the folks on the line said data quality and governance are inadequate. 18% said customization of ERP. 16% said lack of ERP knowledge, and 13% said unable to access timely information. Okay, Noni, I think this was a trick question because it seems to me that all of these are related, aren't they?
They are for sure, and they are probably the top 5 most common challenges that I see across everybody that I talk to. I don't think anyone has one of these in isolation. And everyone is working to overcome them, and some people have done really good jobs around that. We talked about those top performing teams that are able to get the access to the data. They started with those same challenges as everyone else. So there are some of the things we'll address later on really start to address how to overcome some of these challenges.
Before we let you do that, Noni, one question that invariably will come up is, well, wait a second, Mark, well, shouldn't we just have our ERP handle all of this? How would you respond to that?
That is a great question and one I hear all the time. And so with your ERP system, the question, if you're saying your ERP is going to be managing all of that, you're making an assumption that your controls that are built into your ERP system are correct, that people aren't able to circumvent those controls, that your ERP has access to all the different data sources, which in reality it doesn't. There's always areas where there's workarounds that have been developed within your ideal processes. There's areas where your ERP system, maybe the control has the ability for people to override, and there's ways for people to manually circumvent things that once you pull the data from your ERP system, you really are able to get visibility into.
Well, Noni, it's clear that the folks on the line are having some challenges managing their data. Tell us how it is we can improve that process and eliminate risk in our organizations.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, I really wanted to start off today with this quote from E.O. Wilson, which is, "We are drowning in information, but starved for wisdom." And so for those of you that don't know, E.O. Wilson is really he's a famous American biologist, but this quote really resonates with me because it really speaks to the proliferation and the volume of data that we've been seeing across all industries over the last couple of decades. In marketing, sales, finance, operations, everyone is challenged with the fact that they've got all of this data, but how are they able to use this data strategically and really understand how they can think critically about it and make wise choices based on what they're learning from their data. And I think it's becoming more and more critical for organizations to really understand how to use their data. And as you opened up, really, Mark, today, it's really all about the data. So how can we really get data to help us with our P2P processes? How can we get them to start making us feel that we are managing our procurement processes correctly, that we are able to, we are making the right buying choices, we do have the most efficient processes, all of those things. And there's lots of opportunities for how data can begin to help us. And I think the first thing is it really helps us to find and focus on those what's strategic and what's important. So specifically helping us to identify inefficiencies within our processes, understanding what we can automate versus where we need to add where our knowledge workers really need to add value, and be able to quickly and more easily respond to requests for information. Data is also a really great way for us to be able to better support your organizational goals. So really being able to identify what data is important for you to achieve your strategic objectives, as well as measuring where, how you're measuring what risks are occurring, and measuring performance in your form of KPIs and KRIs, and monitoring that over time so that it's not being managed in a spreadsheet or you're spending a lot of time just trying to pull that data out. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how data can help you really deliver savings and values. And really, for the most part, like I would actually say that most companies aren't really looking to save a whole bunch of cash, but when we're looking at managing our cash effectively, making sure that it's being used in the best way, that we're not being overcharged by vendors or we're getting the right deal from our vendors. We are actually being able to allocate resources into the right budgets properly in terms of what we know what the spending trends are, all of those different things so that we can really support, it goes back to supporting those key and strategic initiatives within your organization. So I want to start off today with really talking about proactively identifying errors and fraud. And it is errors and fraud. I think we often talk about fraud in terms of the loss to your organization. There's high risk in terms of the reputational risk. But there's also a lot of the analytics that I'm going to talk about can also support you just in identifying errors. So it might not actually be anything malicious that is occurring. So to start things off, I think it's important to kind of look at the types of fraud that occur within those P2P processes. And so the ACFE, which is the Association of Fraud Examiners, publishes a report every year that looks at fraud across organizations. And operational fraud is one of the biggest categories of fraud, and within that, asset misappropriation is one of the largest categories. And what's interesting, most recently, they've pulled together, they've really broken down what it means for asset misappropriation. And the two things that I've circled and highlighted here that I want to highlight is the greatest dollar value are in two areas, around billing and check and payment transporting. Both of those, one's at $100,000 on average, and the other is at $150,000. And both of those are sitting in more significant risk areas. So as an area that where your organization is likely to see risk, definitely those understanding how you can be testing and identifying fraud within your P2P processes can really help to mitigate or reduce the risk that you have from potential fraud in these areas. So how do you actually, we're going to go into a poll, which is the next poll that we have, which is how do you analyze your P2P data today?
All right, it's about to be displayed on your screen. We want to know, where would you classify your finance team on the maturity model? We don't use data analytics today. We use analytics on an ad hoc basis. Our analytics are repeatable but run manually. Our analytics are automated. Our analytics help us be more proactive, or we use predictive analytics. Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen, and we're going to discuss the results in just a moment. So how would you grade most organizations, Noni, in terms of how they're using analytics today?
Most organizations, and it's interesting, this is a question that I've asked before at conferences, and most people tend to say they're using analytics on an ad hoc basis. They tend to be relatively early, but you do have a much smaller percentage that are much more proactive or even getting into predictive analytics. But for the majority, what we typically see, or what I've seen when I've asked this question to various audiences, is that they're still in the early stages, or they've got a few analytics that they're running on a regular basis.
And is that enough? I mean, what do organizations need to be doing today?
They really need to be moving, I think, bringing their analytics in and automating the manual repetitive processes so that they are able to free up those knowledge workers to be able to really focus on moving towards more of a proactive, or even into the predictive mindset, that they're able to use their analytics to really help their organization achieve their goals.
Now, there's a lot of confusion when I talk to end users about what is analytics. They claim, well, some vendors have taken some reporting tools and put a marketing spin on them. How do we know true analytic tools versus marketingware?
So are you talking about sort of like BI tools specifically, Mark? Yeah. So one of the ways that I would differentiate, or how I look at analytics tools, your analytics tools are really the big key differentiator between those, and often they work in parallel with an analytics tool like ours, is that when you look at a BI tool, that takes your already clean data that you've already done most of your analysis on, and it allows you to present it in a consumable format. And that's what your BI tool really is allowing you to do. Versus an analytic tool is going to be able to allow you to not only run your analytics and slice and dice the data that you need to do, but it also allows you to get all of your data, prepare your data, and then run a number of different types of analysis, everything from simple summarizing or classifying of data to different commands into areas such as machine learning if you want to run a cluster k-means or something like that. And so they start to do more of the heavy lifting.
We asked our attendees how they would classify their finance team on the maturity model. 37% of the folks on the line say their analytics are repeatable but run manually. 27% of the folks on the line say we use analytics on an ad hoc basis. 15% don't use analytics today. 13% have automated analytics. 7% are saying that analytics are helping them be more proactive. So give me the message you want the folks on the bottom end of this maturity model to hear from you today, Noni.
I think the one thing I want them to know is that there's lots of room. I think with the maturity model, there's room to grow, and they can begin to adopt things and adopt analytics into their processes. It doesn't have to be a big, huge change, but they can begin to, if they want to meet the top end of that maturity model, they can start on sort of a stepwise path to get there.
Tell us how we can start doing that then.
All right. So one of the first things that I think I want to start to talk about a little bit is understanding some of your analytics that you can take a look at just to look for fraud or potential errors within that. And I'm presenting a list of different analytics here that help you to identify what's happened, potentially so that you can identify any of those potential issues. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of red flags that you can use to look at your data, but these are some of the most common ones that I see people using, looking at how the receiving data that they get, the contract data, and as well the invoice data. I think you mentioned one of them up at the beginning where you talked about duplicate payments, a very common one. Those can be simple errors or they can actually be fraud. And by creating even just one or two of these analytics, that's a great way to start bringing analytics into your organization. And it means there's one less thing for you to have to worry about. Your compliance you're making sure you're compliant with your internal policies, as well as rather than waiting for an audit to come in and tell you that you've made a mistake or they've identified issues or potentially reducing that risk. So there's lots of opportunities with these different analytics that you can potentially run. Now, the thing is, given that there's all these analytics, people are always worried, what am I going to do with all of these different exceptions that I'm potentially going to deal with? And the question they ask is it possible to really get on top of these red flags, on top of these fraud risks? And I would say yes, it is possible with robotic process automation. Because part of your analytics, as you go through that process, I'm going to walk you through those different steps as we go along here. You can look at that process of simply running the analytics and automating certain steps so that you can really focus your people on the high-value tasks within this. So when we look at how we monitor data or how we have to access our data, the first thing, and I think a number of people identified this earlier, is they have to deal with all these disparate data sources. You have ERPs, you have contract databases, you have your receiving databases, you might have data in Excel or PDF. There's all these different data sources. And what you need to be able to do is really find a way to connect, find out which data within those different data sources is going to be valuable to you. The good thing is once you're able to do that or start to hone in on different areas, you're able to actually start to identify that useful data. And from there, you can start to determine what you need to pull out from an analytic perspective. And you could start quite simply with just looking at duplicate payments and understanding which of the fields that you need to look at. It might be your vendor, it might be information from your vendor list, it would be information from the invoicing list, and things that you can start to cross-match and take a look at. From there, once your useful data has been identified, you can extract your data, then run those analytics that you've built, and then of course, if you're monitoring that data, you want to alert your stakeholders and then report and monitor so that your stakeholders are aware what's going on. Now, when we look at this entire process here, it would be quite a manual process, and you see a lot of people I often see people spending 80% of their time simply on data extraction, data cleansing, normalization, and then running their exceptions, and then they get their list of exceptions. And by then, they've run out of time. What are we going to do with all of these different exceptions? And that's where robotics come in. And when we talk about robotics process automation, it really is about looking for ways to incrementally or sustainably add capacity without always having to rely or increasing on headcount budgets. I think this is such a critical part in terms of when we look at how we define what robotic process automation is. It isn't about replacing the people on your team. It's about freeing up their time from things that aren't necessarily required. They're so repetitive that they aren't able to focus on, let's deal with the actual reasons why these exceptions are happening. Why are we getting duplicate payments? Why are we getting problems with the invoicing? And once you're able to do that as well, it helps to raise your internal profile of the team for durable value-added capabilities across the entire team. So really, potentially, if you've got control problems happening within your ERP system, be able to address those, or potentially do process reengineering to fix issues so they stop happening, so they're really freed up to focus on those activities that help your organization. And what's interesting, there's a great report that McKinsey produced recently, is when they talk about activities within your organization today with the technology that's available today that are really available for automation, two of the top three highest activities are collecting data and processing data. And if you think about what's happening in your teams, you think about your P2P process and how much is happening in paper and people pulling data and checking to make sure that this is the right amount and et cetera, a lot of that can be automated, as well as just being able to have your analytics run on various types of data. The other thing that is another interesting stat that a lot of people talk about is when we think about our accounting or finance work, is there is an estimate or this prediction that robotics are going to automate or eliminate up to 40% of transactional accounting work by 2020. Now that's a year away. We're a couple of weeks shy of 2019. So if we look at where our teams are today, and I think many people mentioned they're still at the beginning of their automation and analytics journey, there's a lot of change that's happening in our industry, and I think and across the industry in terms of what sort of skill sets you're going to need in your team, and what does it mean for the work that you're doing today. But if you look at it from that, some people tend to look at it as a fear-based, oh, the jobs are disappearing, but it's really an opportunity for your organization and for your finance team to become more focused on what's strategically important for your business and for your organization. So let's go back to that picture that I talked about before, and really looking at your automated monitoring. And one of the things that you're able to do and bring your robotics or your robotic process automation in is the actual, everything from that data extraction piece where you're having a robot go out to all of your multiple different systems. It might be Excel files in an FTP folder somewhere in SharePoint. It might be within your SAP or Concur system, wherever you need to pull data. You're able to extract that data, run the analytics that you've already built. You've spent the time to build it, so schedule for those to run on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, whatever makes sense for you to do. Then alert you when you have issues, so that then your stakeholders really are focusing their human insight on the issues rather than just pulling the data to trying to get a hold of the data. And then as well, you're able to create dashboards. And so earlier there was the question that asked a little bit about what do we do with these BI tools and all that sort of stuff, but really those become valuable in pushing your data into a dashboard where people can monitor, measure your KPIs and KRIs. And then, of course, by automating through that process, you're able to cycle it back through. You really remove the operational burden that you had within your organization. So just a quick example to walk you through what that might look like. Here's an example of a very manual process where someone would go out, retrieve data, then another person would read and scrape the data. If it was in, say, a PDF or a non-standardized format, they'd export it into a text file, combine, normalize, and analyze that data. They might be using an analytics tool like ACL today and be just running that part, and then they push out their exception. And if you're looking at how that process is very, very manual. It takes a lot of work. I know people who spend, 2 days just pulling, retrieving, cleansing data to get it into a shape that they can run their analytics on. And so if you're trying to do that on a weekly or a monthly basis, you can imagine how much time and resources that takes. And for some people, it's not a happy job. And then by bringing robotics into the picture, you're really able to take out that front-end load of grabbing the data, normalizing it, and bringing it into a format that your analytics can run. So your people begin to focus, like I said before, on those exceptions. Now I want to share a little example with one of the U.S. state government that I worked with recently where they did just that to reduce their vendor overpayments. The challenge that they had is they lacked the standard framework or technology solution in place when they looked at all of their invoices. It was a very labor-intensive process to reconcile all their invoices from all of the transactions that occurred across their entire state. The problem they were finding is they knew that vendors didn't always comply with agreed-upon prices, or they might charge different departments different amounts. They weren't able to adjust for that. And at the end of the day, spending time, it was so intensive, they didn't have enough resources to really work on investigating and managing any of the refunds or following up on that. So the way they solved that is what they did is they brought in an automated monitoring program to monitor 100% of their payments prior to disbursement. Now this is an important thing. It wasn't a retroactive. They were being very proactive in terms of their approach. They were able to compare vendor prices from the contracts and payments against the statewide contracts that they had, and they were able to publish these systems for more detailed, or publish all the exceptions for more detailed remediation. Now the results. Now this is where it gets really interesting because it really changed their profile for that within the entire state in terms of how they're able to manage all of those funds and vendor payments that they were doing. First of all, they provided management oversight over all of statewide activities. Then they were able to recover as well $2.9 million due to incorrect billing. And now this was essential for them because not only are they dealing with the loss of funds, but these are taxpayer funds that can go into other programs and other services helping the public. It helped to improve the overall vendor compliance. And I remember one of the other things that came out of this as well, their vendors had less problems with the payments they were having. There were issues with payments going out to vendors, so the vendors were happier with them as well. It reduced their improper payment rate, and it reduced their overall risk, because you can imagine in state government when taxpayer funds are spent where they're not supposed to be spent, there's always a lot of reputational risk and public uproar when that occurs. And one of the things that I want to mention as well, we often talk about analytics in terms of finding these exceptions, but I think it's so essential as part of your automated monitoring system is to make sure you're addressing your exceptions. So finding red flags only matter when something is done about them. And one of the challenges that we see is that, and often I see, is people will, well, we've got our exceptions, we spit them out into an Excel document, and then they sit on someone's computer. And so looking at how you can automate those processes to bring, say there's a duplicate payment, you need to be able to send that out right away and notify, hey, is this correct? Or if somebody's purchased this on their purchase card, have they actually gotten the right approvals? And you can have a robotics, you can use automation to really have the system manage all of those exceptions for you. So it's not on, the burden isn't on that person who finds the exceptions to follow up and send 100 different emails out to people. And that really creates accountability within your organization. So how does automation really improve that, and how does automation help you to improve financial decision making? Now, one of the things that I wanted to highlight is there's a number of, we've talked a lot about how we were able to pull data, get the data, reduce that automation, or reduce the effort in terms of just getting the data. I mentioned just now that you're able to actually take your data and automate how you remediate any exceptions that you're finding, so your teams aren't emailing people constantly and trying to nag them and track people down. But as well, one of the areas is around reporting and really pushing your data automatically into a real-time dashboard so people can get better transparency and internal transparency over the data that you have, as well as enforcing internal compliance. And so you can really start to improve accountability across your organization and understand what's happening by publishing a lot of these results. The next is it really one of the other areas you can help you with is vendor and contract oversight, and really understanding where are your high-risk vendors, how critical are those vendors to your organization, are you managing them correctly? And I think one of the other things that Mark mentioned earlier with your vendors is those data points around those operational data points I saw on one of the lists. It was understanding how long is it taking us to pay our vendors, are we paying them appropriately, are we, do we have opportunities for cost savings where we might have a vendor who's working independently across multiple departments where we can do some sort of, we can get some bulk discounting, things like that. Next is around sourcing, how you source your analytics, or sourcing your vendors and the materials that you use within your organization, and really getting better operational oversight into those. So understanding, are we buying the right things, and are we using the right processes to buy them, and are we getting the value out of our spend? And so that really helps you by looking at those particular metrics that you develop. Are we actually measuring the things that we need to be measured to make sure that our dollars are spent effectively? And you can make decisions as you go along, start to do predictive decisions around when are we spending things, when do we need to have budget, and who is potentially always chronically overspending, and things like that that you can start to address. And then finally, starting to deal with some of those strategic analysis, and understanding what are the important KPIs and KRIs that you need to measure. Are there particular risks that you need to address? Are there different exceptions that you need to address with the individual vendors that you're working with? Also looking at understanding where how your budgets might be wildly different than reality, and understanding where you might be able to predict and allocate budgets so that the budgets aren't being exceeded wildly. You know ahead of time when something like that might occur. So how do you get started? If you're just starting out with analytics today and you're right at the beginning curve, or you've got some running in your team, how do you start to bring automation into your processes? The first, as we mentioned before, we talked a little bit about the robotics and automation maturity curve, and we assessed that many people are at different areas. Really, it's a journey, and I don't think you should look at this maturity curve and think, oh my gosh, I need to get to predictive by 2020 in the next year. It's a journey. It's going to take steps to get throughout each of these different areas.
And that brings us to our next poll question, which is about to be displayed on your screen. We want to know, what is your biggest challenge to implementing data analytics and automation in your organization today? Is it getting management buy-in? Is it accessing siloed data? Is it marketing the program internally? Is it having the right skill sets on your team? Is it knowing where to start? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen. We're going to discuss the results in just a moment. While they do that, we've had a couple of questions come in, Noni, asking about how to build a business case for analytics. And one of their attendees noted that their management seems to focus in on labor savings, and they're wondering how is it that they can articulate the value of the type of visibility we're discussing today to management.
That's a great question. One of the areas that I see a lot of people articulating ROIs, there is the labor savings that definitely come with how much time is spent in terms of showing, you know, for us to be able to do this, we'd either have to hire a new person or buy a technology, but we also I would also suggest looking at where your cost savings potentially are. So how many errors do you have in your system today that initially analytics can really help you pull out? And there's a lot of good stats around, you can go to the ACFE and understanding on the average, if you've got an analytics, any sort of analytics or monitoring in place, you can really improve typically like reducing fraud by often like 60 or 70% just by bringing that in. And so those dollar amounts are another thing that you can start to bring in to improve your ROI. So I think that's another approach that you can take.
We asked our attendees what is their biggest, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was so anxious to share these results with you, Noni. We asked our attendees, what is the biggest challenge to implementing data analytics in their organization? 29% of the folks said having the right skill sets on their team. 24% said getting management buy-in. 21% said accessing siloed data. Leading behind the pack was knowing where to start and marketing the program internally. So speak to those folks who have identified having the right skill sets on their team as being such a challenge. What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I'm actually going to put that on hold for just a second, Mark, because I talk a little bit about that in a slide about 2 down that I'd like to be able to get to. Yeah, so why don't I move into those areas. So what I wanted to talk about is the tips for getting started with automation. My first tip that I always give people is to start small. You need to look at that implementation of bringing in automation, not as I need to cover all of my processes today, but start with one process and really be agile in terms of the development as you bring that in, so you can learn and build upon that. And that will set you up for success, and this is another great way to explain to management the value. You pick something simple like a process. I've often seen people do this with purchase cards, for example. Automate the process and looking at where their exceptions are. There are a bunch of people spending on weekends and evenings when they shouldn't be. It might not be a high-risk area, but is definitely an area where they can start to show value right away. The next is investing in the right technologies. And so part of that is, again, starting small, looking for technologies that can scale with you. You don't need to buy the $2 million technology that's going to take 3 years to implement, because your time to value is much longer. You want to look at something that can help you with those ad hoc analytics and then help you to move towards automation. It allows your team to learn, as well as it really helps you with those initial processes that you're starting to work with. And the next is building your team. So people mention finding people is the hard thing. And it is definitely, as the role of the finance team is really changing in terms of the need to be data scientists and analytics experts, but you also need people that are familiar with process automation and people that are good at communicating data, which is so essential. And the one thing I would say is there's no such thing as a perfect unicorn that is going to have all of those different skill sets within them. Start by looking within your own team. There's often people with the aptitude for analytics, the aptitude or the interest to really start to move up. And if you're starting out your projects, they're able to start with one of those initial processes and really learn from that. And then you may start to look, depending on as you start to build out your program, it may make sense to bring in a data scientist because you're wanting to run more predictive analytics, things like that. But I think it's knowing that not one person is really going to solve all of those different all of the different needs that you have in your team, and you need to look at those skill sets within your team and really grow the aptitude and the interest that you have within your individual team. And the other thing is, too, I mentioned as well, somebody who's into process engineering. I think one of the common things is you start off on those initial processes around automating. You've got your ideal process that you want to do. In reality, there's 400 workarounds that go along with that ideal process. So often you've got to have people that are able to think critically about those processes, and as you start to automate, you're going to go with the shortest path and make sure that it's most efficient. So how do we don't just take what we have today and automate it, but making it better as you go. So in conclusion, I think any team, regardless of your size, can really bring in analytics and start to automate those processes. It's going to be a necessity as you move along. There's more data than that Excel spreadsheets and people can manage today. And as you start to go down this journey, don't think about always having to conquer everything at once. You can start small, start somewhere scalable, and continue to grow those skills and the technologies that you have that are available to you as you grow in your organization. Thank you.
One question from an attendee, Noni, was which KPIs are most impacted by the kind of strategy you've laid out here today?
Oh my gosh, that would be such an interesting question. I think that's really a question around, I can only assume they're talking more about like what KPIs can they potentially be monitoring. So it might be looking at, you might have a performance indicator where you're looking at how quickly are we paying our vendors, or what is the level of how are we managing you can even manage what's our spend look like compared to our budgeted versus actual, and what's the forecast by the end of the year. I think with the KPIs, a question I get a lot, what KPIs should I actually be looking at? Really, it comes down to what's important to your organization when it comes to a KPI. No organization is going to be exactly the same, and depending on what's important for you to be measuring, those are the KPIs that are going to be impacted.
And that will be our final word. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation, Noni. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Laura. Ms. Laura?
Thank you, Mark and Noni, for a great webinar today. I just have a few short housekeeping notes to go over before we officially close out. Many of you have asked about the on-demand version of today's webinar. Everyone will receive an email within 2 business days with a link to today's webinar and a link to the presentation as a PDF link. So please look for that in your inbox within the next 2 business days. Also, if you could please fill out the short evaluation form that will appear once you close out of the webinar so that we can better serve your needs in future webinars, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you again to Mark and Noni for a great presentation, and thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. This webinar was brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by ACL. Thank you all, and have a great day.